Welcome everyone for this session. Thank you so much that all of you are there. And it's quite a provocative name, the Seduction of Heterodoxy, Critique as a Pedagogy of Law. And we have a very erudite panel with Professor Yugank Goyal, who is the faculty at Flame Institute, and he's also the director of Center for Alternative Knowledge Systems. Then we have Giuseppe Mastruzzo, who's a director at International University College of Turin, Italy. And we have Professor Peter Schuck, who's an emeritus professor at Yale Law School, and he has a long association with Jindal. So before I feel very conscious in front of this erudite panel, and before I hand over the discussion, let me say a little bit about the theme that we are talking about, which is the seduction of heterodoxy, a critique as a pedagogy of law. So Duncan Kennedy, who is someone that whom we all know is a very outspoken and controversial person, famously said that law school is a very political space. A political space which is, unfortunately for him, suppressed by conventional pedagogy. And by conventional pedagogy, what Kennedy means was that what he meant was that law is always seen as something which is rational, which is neutral, which is never political. So apolitical, rational, neutral space. And it's very, in its very neutrality, it is neither implicated as if it presents itself, that's the appearance law wants to give of itself, that it is neither implicated nor sustains the social hierarchies. So law remains in a closed zone of its own, limited by itself in an autonomous structure, which has nothing to do with either politics or sociology or history, far what to say of literature, psychoanalysis, economics, etc. So law has always been seen in that way, and which is something what was consciously opposed by a lot of thinking, this orthodoxy of law, as they called it. And in the challenge to this standard presentation, or rather I would say the self-presentation of the discipline of law, the most prominent in the 70s was the critical legal studies movement, of which Kennedy was at the forefront. And I sort of recall that in 1977 at Madison, Wisconsin, the famous conference where sort of the critical legal movements took a big charge, and very, very dominant in the 80s, till in the 90s, late 90s, the founders themselves said that it is something which is over, which is dead. But along with the critical legal studies movement, which was trying to question the legal orthodoxy, the self-presentation of law, as I'm calling it, there is also slowly an emergence of the critical race theory, the feminist legal studies, very importantly, which also challenged these orthodox ways of thinking about laws and introducing a sort of interruption at the dinner table of the old-fashioned way of doing law. However, one of the major questions and one of the major challenges of these critical approaches, or the critique, as we can call it, to the pedagogy of law, was and is that there were some independent courses, there were some independent isolated moments where law and something was taught, law by other means, as Peter Goodrich would call it. But as far as the core courses were concerned, the regular courses in the legal curriculum, they sort of remained innocent of the critical legal pedagogy or the sort of revolution it was trying to make. Now, this is the question that we are trying to address today. This is the question that we are trying to think today with our panelists, that how do we, or in what way, what are the labors required to resuscitate or to bring back the original impulse of the critical legal studies, which some of the framers have themselves sort of pronounced it's given it a death certificate, including Professor Kennedy. How to revive the original impulse, which was very importantly, social transformation, and align it with the constantly emerging ways of thinking about law, which is, as I just said, very clearly coming in the critical race theory, in feminist theory, and now the queer theory, and to still at the margins, but the psychoanalytic theory. So, so this is the question that what do we do to think about critique as a pedagogy of law? And is it true that the institutionalization of these rather radical ideas is itself something that is necessary, but not necessarily desirable? So how do we sort of address the tension between the original radical impulse and the institutionalization of the critical approaches or critique as a pedagogy of law? So I invite our three speakers, starting with Professor Peter Schuck, then Giuseppe Mastruzzo and Yugank Goyal, to give their initial reflections about how do they see the idea of heterodoxy and critique or critical thinking as a form of pedagogy of law. So over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bindal, and I'm delighted to participate in this typical Jindal conference, which is interesting and varied and ambitious. All of those characteristics really do mark the Jindal enterprise. On the topic of heterodoxy, I want to start with some very basic propositions. The first is heterodoxy requires a definition. There is a famous quote from the 19th century in the United States, just to indicate how far back the debate over heterodoxy extends, to the effect that your orthodoxy is my heterodoxy and my orthodoxy is your heterodoxy. So there is really no firm place to moor law that enables us to say that one is orthodox and the other is heterodox, except to the extent that we want to count the kinds of lectures and words and ideas that are pursued at particular schools of law. My empirical claim would be that law is primarily concerned with the rules and adjudication and some of the rather standard attributes that have been taught in law schools from the very beginning. And today, every law school, at least in the United States, every law school of which I'm aware, appreciates the importance of those rules and those conventions, and the respect for rationality and some of the other virtues that that critical legal studies and other critical enterprises have tried to discredit. So as a matter of sheer numbers in the United States, at least, orthodoxy, as it's defined by the claims by the heterodox, is still very much in the ascendancy. The second point I want to make is that heterodoxy, so defined by the heterodox, folks who claim that they are heterodox, is like every other orthodoxy, often wrong, both in its basic definitions and its application to particular cases. I think that's particularly true of critical legal studies, but it's also true of critical race theory. So before we celebrate heterodoxy as a very positive change and innovation in the legal academy, we want to question, we want to interrogate very carefully whether these so-called innovations are accurate or not. And in the case of critical race theory and in critical legal studies, my claim is that they're often inaccurate. And they present a false picture of the world, a false picture of the way in which law can and will operate, and therefore deserves a good deal of skepticism before we embrace it simply because it seems like it's new and fresh. I'll stop there.
You're muted, Amit.
Okay, shall I follow up on Peter's remarks? Well,
yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
I feel at home here for three reasons. The first one is that, the International University College of Turin is a partner of Jindal since 2009, since the very first, year Jindal started its activities. The second one is that I have, for my college, as a scientific guarantor, Duncan Kennedy, who has come here some half a dozen times to teach. And also, if I may say that to Peter's advantage, Guido Calabresi. He is the other scientific guarantor from Yale, Emeritus Dean of the Yale Law School. And the third, things that make me at ease is that I do follow Duncan's, recommendations. What are Duncan Kennedy's recommendations? He recommends that we should promote freedom through small, practical acts of analysis, reimagination, resistance, and rebelliousness, organization of rebellion. And, I'm a rebellious director myself. And I think this we should do in our institutional workplace, where, according to Duncan, we should never forget the intellectual importance of irony, of even irrationality and irrationalism as a intellectual position. Law provides the background for all kinds of group struggles, and that is why a law class is an intensely political place, according to Duncan. And I think this is what mainly informs critical legal studies, and perhaps what should inform our pedagogy in the law class today. Let me start from here and now. What is here and now? Here, you see, at this very moment, is everywhere in the world. We are talking from different continents. People are listening to us from different continents. And now is the time of the pandemic. It is a time of crisis where the exercise of critique should be encouraged. Is that so? In my opinion, in our here and now of the current crisis, critique is seen with suspicion, even in law classes, and the alleged neutrality of law is now being reinforced by the notion of the neutrality of science, which has been, discussed and proposed during the COVID-19 crisis. Science is not neutral, though, as it is true that law is not neutral. What the pandemic should teach us is that both science and law are intensely political and represent not universal interests, justice in the case of law, truth in the case of science, but they do represent certain interests. They do not represent an impartial viewpoint. And by the way, a viewpoint is always partial, while the panopticon fortified by the pandemic in recent times is putting the whole world under a standardized control. I think this should be an issue to be discussed in our law class today. Here and now, I was saying, what is striking in the reactions to the emergency devices that have been implemented throughout the whole world, both in authoritarian and democratic regimes, is the inability to observe them beyond the current moment and the local place. Only someone understands them as the global here and now, that is to say, as signs of a longer and larger phenomenon in which a new paradigm of government of people and things is at stake, a new paradigm of what norms should tell us and how rules should be made and from whom. The state of exception determined by reasons of health security has made us accept limitations of freedom that we were not previously willing to accept. In some Western countries, biosecurity has proved capable of presenting the absolute cessation of all political activities and of any relationship as the highest form of civic participation. We have witnessed the paradox of left-wing organizations, traditionally used to claiming rights and denouncing constitutional violations, to accept limitations of freedom that not even fascist regimes have ever dreamed of being able to impose. Constitutional rights and guarantees have been suspended, which had never been questioned before, you see. So I think this is a practical act of rebelliousness that we should have in a law class today. The successive waves of the pandemic, I think, make clear that the state of exception is becoming our ordinary condition. So now is the time for critique. Now is the time for us to recognize law classes as those intensely political places that Duncan refers to. There have been serious epidemics in the recent past, you see, but no one had ever thought of declaring an exception to democracy like the present one, which prevents us even from moving. A society that lives in a protracted state of emergency and urgency cannot be a free society. You know, you cannot have, by the way, even from an etymological, viewpoint, a protracted emergency. Emergency is, by its meaning, something which is temporary and limited. So there is a problem of language as well, and I think that our law class should address that problem of language. The language we've been using even to define our law measures, our new rules, is a language of war. Here in Europe, in many countries, we had a curfew, even an all-day curfew. Last spring, we had a 40-day curfew in Italy and France, for instance. So these emergency norms make us, use the language of war and make us think we are in a condition of war. But the problem is that the enemy is not outside us. The enemy we see within us. The enemy is our neighbor who doesn't do something. The enemy is our neighbor who doesn't comply with some limitations of freedom. It is evident to me that social distancing is becoming the standard politics that awaits us, and that the distancing is favoring digital monopolies, technological devices, instead of human relationships in their physicality, as we are experiencing even here in this, platform, and now at this very moment in this conference. In question here and now is not only, so I think, the teaching of law, but also an entire conception of our destiny as human society. From the law class to human society, we've seen first politics replaced by economics. Now we see a new paradigm that is affirmed, to which all other factors must be sacrificed, which is health security. So I ask myself, a democracy that decides to give up the certainty of law and to give up some of its citizens' fundamental rights, is that the terrain of Carl Schmitt's Ausnahmezustand, the state of exception, which is not, it is no man's land between the juridical order and the political fact, and between the rule of law and its revocation. All over the world, we are forced to watch a sad spectacle, all these petty sovereigns that, you know, justify Schmitt's famous definition of the sovereign as the one who decides on the state of exception, you know. All over the world, we are getting accustomed to the use of emergency decrees through which executive powers actually replace the legislative ones, abolishing the principle of separation of powers. And it is not clear what will happen once the limit of time validity of the urgent decrees has been exhausted. In any case, you see what we have accepted all in these recent months cannot be cancelled and constitutes a very dangerous precedent. One of Duncan Kennedy's main teachings is that the system exercises less control over life than we may think, so that resistance, even small-scale resistance in our law class, is always at least a possibility worth trying. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for those very provocative and very thoughtful remarks, which I think are extremely important. I would go to Professor Yugank Goyal to have his remarks on the topic.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks a lot for having me over. And I am really humbled to be in this audience, particularly after the remarks of both Professor Giuseppe and Professor Peter Schuck. And Professor Peter Schuck particularly because he's been one of the early people who had inspired me to think about law. And Amit, to have you present in this audience, in this group as well, is humbling for me indeed, because you have been my one of the first law teachers outside the classroom, so to speak. So I'm glad to be here. I'm going to be very quick, and I think some of the things some of the things that have been mentioned earlier are things that I will carry in concurrent with myself. But I'll make 3 points very quickly. So the first point is going to be some sort of so what does heterodoxy or critical studies or being critical mean to me personally and to the engagements that I've had with my students and other academics? The second point would be more of a definitional discourse. And the third point would be a critique of a critique in some form of a self-referential logic. So, I mean, when you look at, I'm reminded of Pierre Bourdieu's very famous phrase of homo academicus. And personally, I feel the idea and, note on which Professor Giuseppe ended is Kennedy's construct about or the source or the foundation of critical legal studies from a classroom reminds me of Pierre Bourdieu's Homo Academicus. And here's a quote from him. "It is not, as is usually thought, political stances which determine people's stances on things academic, but their positions in the academic field which informs the stances they adopt on political issues in general, as well as on academic problems." So in other words, the idea is that political stance are often determined by academic stance. And I think what critical legal studies, critical thinking in law, heterodoxy in law is squarely, fundamentally an academic state of being. And from there it goes, if at all it does, to practice. And I think this is important for us to recognize because as you know, Amit and I have had those discussions back in the days what does it take for critical legal studies to go beyond the classroom experiences into the courts of law, into the law firms, into the engagements in international organization. And therefore, the ability for us to recognize that this otherwise, a phrase which carries relatively sort of vague, mushy, fuzzy, disturbingly long history of having a, meaning which goes across, there is a limit to which how much it can be explained. So I think it's an academic exercise, first of all. The second thing which, and by recognizing that this is an academic exercise, we recognize the limits to it. And therefore, I would welcome Peter's remark on how we must be skeptical about looking at heterodoxy as something that accurately describes the real world. And so there I would agree with Professor Schuck. The second point is that if you really scratch and pry open the surface level understanding of heterodoxy or critical legal studies, it looks like that it's a relational state of being. I mean, it's basically almost exclusively defined by its oppositional situation in a particular field of academic disposition or academic production. The reality of heterodoxy, if one can put it as if the reality of critique it is, it's essentially the reality of a self-conscious disagreement with the mainstream. One of my former colleagues in Institute for Global Law and Policy, Akbar Rusolo, famously reminded me of these lines, that the reality of heterodoxy is reality of a self-conscious disagreement with the mainstream, which means that in order to recognize where heterodoxy lies, there is already a presupposed assumption of what mainstream is. And that assumption may or may not locate, dislocate, configure, reconfigure what is the heterodoxy. And so therefore, if it is purely relational, then we have to find out whether the structures on which heterodoxy is built are also the same structures in which orthodoxy is built. And if they are the same structures, then we haven't got anywhere, have we? So, if they're bound, if heterodoxy is bound by the same type of presuppositional institutional rules, disciplinary practices, boundaries, then we are essentially going around in circles. So at some point, opposition to slavery was heterodoxy. Today's slavery, supposedly Aristotelian view of slavery could be considered heterodox. So in a way, this is sort of coming full circle. And this takes me to my third point, which is the problem that I see at a more epistemic level. I think heterodoxy itself is carving out a theory of how legal pedagogy or classroom or law classroom is, or even legal discipline as it is practiced is. Now, theories are by nature intolerant. And intolerance is seductive, as the topic of the session goes. So if theory is intolerant, then clearly heterodoxy will become orthodoxy over time, or it has a likelihood, or it runs into the risk of becoming orthodoxy, because it will be intolerant towards many other things. So think about the standard narratives that we have about privacy laws, for instance. Right, so there is a mainstream view of what privacy is all about and why we should be worried about the big tech taking over our lives. But if you wander through the streets of India, practically speaking, no one frankly cares about privacy. Parents go through the cupboards of their teenage kids without blinking an eye. We enter into each other's rooms in a family or even in friends' houses. We call them at odd hours. We don't. For most people who I engage with, particularly those who belong to a group of, economically, sort of disadvantaged, would not even, in the wildest of their dreams, would think about privacy as an issue for themselves. But there is a theoretical construction around which we have over privacy. Ashish Nandi, in his famous book Intimate Enemy, reminds us how George Orwell, when he was working in the East India Company's forest department, and he was posted in Burma back in the days. There was an elephant that had went wild in that village. So all these villagers came to George Orwell because he was a forest officer and requested him to kill the elephant. George Orwell didn't want to do it. But he writes in this short story called Shooting an Elephant, how he was overpowered and overwhelmed by the expectations that the colonized had placed on the colonizer, that the colonizer should free the colonized of this elephant which has gone berserk. And the story ends with how, with a heavy heart and with a great hesitation, he indeed kills the elephant. And Ashish Nandi uses it to weave the argument that colonization actually changes the colonized as well. Now, using this, can we really consider that a universal or linear theory of an orthodoxy about colonization is possible? Because in my view, I think a lot more could be, a lot more of a law classroom could be enriched a lot more by bringing in practice, bringing in the empirics, and looking at how a society evolves empirically and not necessarily through a theory. And so finally, sort of a critique of a critique would be that despite challenging the orthodoxy, heterodoxy still remains a theory, just like orthodoxy, and therefore uses the same institutional structures that it is otherwise trying to erode. Thanks.
Thank you, Yugank. This is really all the three very sort of interesting comments in this way that I see Professor Mastruzzo really questioning a very important point, which I think is so relevant in some ways, invoking Giorgio Agamben about the normativeness of the exception. And as sort of the Carl Schmitt's notion, which I think is very interesting because Schmitt was also a colleague of Hans Kelsen, who was in some ways an exemplar of sort of positivist legal tradition. And I think this point is very important to think about before I can frame sort of the next sort of thinking or food for thought, that how Professor Mastruzzo said that politics has been taken over by economics, and sort of, especially in the time today when we are seeing the pandemic, can we reclaim in some ways the political? And Yugank, in some ways, I think a very important point you're bringing about institutionalization, which is beyond campus, which is beyond university. And I see a very, I think, and I see a point which sort of goes back to Peter, to whom I'm coming to, because I think Peter has just given an opening statement, a lot more to hear from him. But where Yugank connects to me with Peter is when you say a very important point, actually, that how orthodoxy of heterodoxy, that how there can be a same, like we can fall in the same psychic blocks, and you evoke Ashish Nandi, who is a very important psychoanalytic thinker of colonization. So the sense of our psychic blocks of even when we are radical, we are in some ways, there is a core, as a feminist scholar, Juliette Mitchell, would say, that that when we are moving towards revolution, there's an undertow which pulls us back. So we come back as if. And this point sort of reminded me briefly of a piece, Sleeping with the Enemy, which was written, which sort of challenging the critical legal studies, and it sort of created a lot of resistance. So with that, I come back to Peter, who also made a similar point, that how, and I two very important points, Peter, that how one's orthodoxy is another's heterodoxy and vice versa. And secondly, I think a very important point where you said that there's something like rationality, which is a virtue we need to hold on to. So even when we are talking about critique, we can't just let our existing systems just go all over, but we have to in some way rework them, if at all, but we can't sort of leave them apart. So there, I think I will go for the next set of questions which are arising, and I can see some of the people, some of the audience also interested in these questions. So what would be, in today's time of pandemic, what would be an idea of a global critical legal education, and critical, which is not just like criticism, but originally to the word, as Nietzsche would say, it's something which is sort of creative in some ways. So how would we do that? How would we imagine a global education beyond nationalism? Because nationalism is again a very on the increasing side. We have backseat nationalism and our limitations. So how can we imagine a global critical legal studies staying within the paradigm that we have, but working through it, and going beyond the constraints of nationalism, or sort of thinking which sort of pulls us back, and thinking that sort of leads to this whole idea of emergency as the norm. And also, would you think that it is possible by doing independent courses in your teaching experience? Or do you think that our critical thinking should be pushed in the core courses, in the everyday law curriculum courses? So I would go there back to you, Peter, starting with you to hear more on this. Peter.
Well, you've raised a very, very important question, and I think there's a rather straightforward answer to it. And that is that law teaching involves, among other things, the introduction of and the teasing out, to the extent that one uses a certain technique that involves the student and the teacher in a kind of Socratic dialogue. What the dominant rule of law is with respect to the particular subject, it doesn't matter whether it's domestic relations or taxation or legislation or any of a host of others. To introduce the student to that rational established law, and then begin to take it apart. And taking it apart means questioning the definitions that are used in that rule of law, an examination of the consequences of that rule of law, which are often much more complicated than the critical legal studies scholars acknowledge, because there are not only the first order effects, but there are second and third order effects that we can trace if we are truly critical. And they often end up describing a world that's rather different than the world that the critical legal studies or critical rights theories, critical race theorists imagine. So you introduce the students to the dominant rule of law, you introduce them to the exceptions to that rule of law, you introduce them to the necessity for interrogating those understandings of law with regard to a host of social science methodologies, asking what are the likely consequences of a particular rule of law being applied in a particular way. Are there inherent properties, inherent moral contents to those conventional rules of law that might trump certain consequential factors, such that the law ought to exemplify those moral claims, even if the consequences of doing so are not necessarily what one would expect. And having done that, you explore the intricacies and ambiguities of language, of exceptions, of remedies, which is something we haven't discussed so far, but the very, very important notion of remedies for violations of legal rights. Questions about the underlying policy consequences of particular versions of a rule of law. These are operations that should occur in any classroom, whether it's being taught by a more traditional legal scholar or a critical legal scholar. And the results of those inquiries will often surprise the teacher himself or herself, because it's very complicated. The notion of what causes what, and what unexpected consequences flow from a particular rule of law. These are very, very difficult matters to master. And the existing social science methodologies for getting at those consequential questions are not all that powerful. That's something else that the student needs to understand, the strengths and the limitations of social science as a guide to what the consequences of any particular legal regime would be. So it's for those reasons that I began my comment earlier in trying to downplay the distinction between conventional law teaching and critical legal studies properly understood and properly defined and properly executed. I think if the instructor is highly skilled at what she or he does, the students will be open to a much more rich and complex set of understandings of how law works.
Thank you, Peter. Giuseppe, any response or addition to the comments?
Yes, I would like to thank Professor Schuck for his remarks, and I will follow up on some questioning of words that he suggests we should do in the law class, some legal terms that this crisis should encourage us to question. Also, I would like to thank you, Amit, to cite Giorgio Agamben. We are working with him here at college. We had a seminar on the 10th of November by Giorgio Agamben, and we are going to have another one on the 8th of December on the meaning of some terms during the pandemic. The first meaning that he questions and we question with him is that of the right to life, which is, a huge point of that justifies some measures in the current crisis. And Agamben, and we do with him, questions the meaning of life, because one thing is naked life, and another thing altogether, he argues, is a life which is worth living. So a life which we understand as human, here and now, again, here being the global space we are inhabiting together, and now being the beginning of the third millennium. And certainly for a full life, he argues, we understand more than what we are offered in a situation of limitations of movement, freedom, and so on and so forth. Exercising the right to have access to common spaces, exercises the right to have a relationship which is also physical together. The second thing that I would like to underline in this globalization that has found an acceleration with the pandemic, is the privatization of the legal space. Guido Calabresi from Yale, who's a friend also, and he comes regularly to Turin, to our college, has been talking about the idea that now big private platforms, big private monopolies do decide about our rights. Facebook can expel you from a space which by now is public. Twitter has expelled even the US president at some point, and that was certainly a highly democratic move. But again, we do not have any right of appeal against those private, private sovereigns. And a third, word I would like to question with you all, and certainly with Yugank, who proposed it, is the word rational and rationality. I think that, it is a misleading word. Rational choice, for instance, in economics is something highly questionable as a principle of behavior. And I think that we do need some other word. I don't have immediately a substitute, but I can say that I'm not satisfied with the term. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I especially thought a very condensed and important word, private sovereignties, private sovereign that are mushrooming. Yugank, please go ahead.
Thanks. I actually agree with you, Professor Giuseppe. I'm not sure if I was not able to convey my idea about rationality, but quite clearly it has been highly misused and fairly academically quite dangerously used word, rationality, that you mentioned. But to come back to the point that Amit was making, and I think it's the points made both the points made by Professor Schuck and Professor Giuseppe. I think my 2 pence is the following. Again, 2 points. I personally think that to find out, a universalizing design of pedagogy across law schools globally may not be an idea that should merit our attention at a principal level. So in many ways, I think societies are often, different societies have different questions that they ask themselves. And in one way is how you understand civilization and different societies is what are the questions that are important to them. Some questions that are important, and this depends, and by society, I'm using the word society very liberally. And therefore, I think critical legal studies or heterodoxy within law school curriculum should respond to should respond directly to the society that it is located. Should respond to the cultures that it is responding to. Should respond to the ecologies of knowledge that it harbors itself in. And that may differ from place to place within India, from India to US, from US to Canada, and within US from state to state. And therefore, my sense is I don't look at critical legal studies as some form of a discipline to be brought into the classroom universally in the same way across the world, but as a method of inquiry, which can be used for different types of questions, not the same type of questions. So, and that is why I think what is more important in my view is to evolve critical thinking classes within the law schools in the first semester itself. So using logic and using the Euclidean, the Descartesian theory-based logic systems, the systems based out of logic, to understand how philosophically or jurisprudentially legal principles evolve. So that's one. And second, I think the best way for them to understand or to encounter their anxieties about what is heterodoxy, we should send them to the field. So I think the most important part of any so-called critical legal education should be exposing students to the field, to let them go to the courts, let them go to the local courts rather than the Supreme Courts or high courts or the big courts. Get them to see what the world is all about. It's an interesting thing because there's an exercise I often do when I am engaging with law school students. I often ask them, do you think the world will be a better place if there are no lawyers? Let's say by some magical stroke of a pen, lawyers don't exist. So of course, disputes are there and there are adjudications taking place through all kinds of different mechanisms, but there is no formal method of adjudicating in a court of law. There are no lawyers. And so my question is not about, so my hypothetical question is, do you think the world will be a better place than it is today or a worse place than it is today? And the funny thing is, it doesn't matter what the answer is, there is never a universal answer. I mean, Gandhi tried to propose an answer. The world would be a better place without lawyers. He very proudly writes about in his book, Hind Swaraj, himself being a lawyer. But if the answer to this question is not a consensual one, whether yes, the world will be a better place or no, the world will not be a better place, that means there's something going on with legal discipline, which requires a more physical, empirical, experiential learning more than, so to speak, the rationalistic way that Professor Giuseppe also talked about.
Thank you, Yugank. Very, 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 very interesting thing. I was thinking whether we have lawyers or not, we certainly need the law in some form or other, whether we call it the law or something else. Which sort of brings me, Yugank, your comments brings me to a question which I'm receiving from the audience also, and maybe that can be a sort of two-pronged question where we can have another set of another round of opinions before we close, which is a twofold question. So one is this, that how do we see, and this is a question which is coming from some of our audience, that how do we see a critique coming from the global south as opposed to the global north? So is it that there is something which Yugank sort of briefly touched upon, something unique or something different in the notion of critique that is developed in the global south, which from say the global north critique? How do we think of, for example, the sort of too fashionable post-colonial sort of critique in this context? And the second thing which you were talking about, universalization, and this is, I'm sort of interested because Yugank made a very sharp point there, and I'm interested in both other panelists also, that one important question that we need to think about is this universal presentation of the liberal subject, which is an abstract legal subject, which we always imagine at the heart of law. So what would be alternative, if not anything else, or if not alternative, then one may say a supplemental imagination of this universalized and universalizing abstract subject? So these 2 points, I think maybe we can start the other way around. So Yugank, we can go with you because you raised those questions. So the global south and the universal abstract legal subject.
So I think I'll probably come up with an example to respond to some of the points that you've laid open. So I think the questions that Western academia or Western cultures or Western civilization, if I can use these broad terminologies, often is interested in are theory-based questions. And so therefore the questions often carry a why, a reason, an argument, which a reasonable man can understand. Now, why is it that something is happening? So, when I was in the Western countries doing my studies or even for other travels, I would often get this question: why don't you eat cows in India? Why don't you eat beef in India? Right? But this obsession with the idea of a why means that there is something important about this frame of thinking in the Western societies. I had never gotten this question in India about so many things that are otherwise differently done in the West. So why is it that they don't wear a kurta would not be? And this is not about power dynamics that I'm talking about. So for instance, I would never think about why is it that people don't eat dogs, but that question doesn't occur to me. So this, and I think historically, Euclidean, Descartesian ways of thinking creates this theory-based thinking as more important or primary to any other way of thinking. Contrast this with the empirics-based thinking that often exists in societies around us, Amit, for example. Right? So when I ask this question to my mother, father, or my grandparents, why don't we eat beef? The simple answer that comes out is, well, because our parents never did, so we don't. So that's just a tradition. So this does not require a theory-based response of a question in terms of why. So there is no dictum which is written somewhere which tells us we should not eat it. This is because, but the point is, this argument is so feeble compared to the argument of a theory-driven exercise, right? So I ask you, why did you do it? And hence my, to respond to your question very quickly, I think the universalization can be addressed by simply looking at whether the type of questions we are asking are originating in an assumption that there is a theory behind some practice, or there is no theory behind some practice, because we can clearly find practices without a theory, and that to me is quite a diametrically opposite way of looking at the world. And people look at the world in this way in many ways. Unfortunately, legal discipline is not carved out. Legal discipline, the Western legal discipline, which is of course a gift to India as well, is carved out of theory-based thinking, right? And that is why, India being a very litigious society also has millions and millions of cases settled outside the court by some elder sitting in, outside the village home, because the belief in this formal word of law is rather limited here. But anyway, I'll stop here because I would really like to hear the answer to this question, which I don't have an answer to, by the way, from both Professor Schuck and Professor Giuseppe.
Thank you. Thank you, Yugank. And as we have always sort of as friends grown up with disagreeing with each other, I would sort of question both your neat binary of West and East, or theory and practice, because I think that theory and empirical thinking to go together is one of the fundamental premise of critical legal thinking. But I should moderate myself. We need our final comments and we have 5 minutes. So let's go to both our speakers for the final comments on these issues so that, we can sort of go for a finish here. So Professor Giuseppe, you go ahead with that.
Yes, first of all, thank you to Jindal for this very stimulating conversation. I am grateful for this. And I want to get very, very quickly to the point of, is there a global South critique instead of some Western-centric critique? I don't know. What I know is that in my little college, we have extremely internationalized classes, and that is critical in itself. You see, we don't even need to address the problem of legal curriculum, because it is the composition of the class itself that makes, the curriculum in a way critically addressed. You see, you talked about the legal subject. Let's, see what is a Western-centric creation, the legal personality of corporations who are immortal by now. And then let's understand what legal personhood has been created by the Global South in recent times, which is the personality of nature and its items, okay? We all know there is this beautiful dissenting opinion in Sierra Club versus Morton, whereby we talk about, this is 1972, we talk about the legal personhood of trees, okay? Do trees have a legal personhood? And this is a dissenting opinion in the US Supreme Court. While if you move south to South America, you will see that then the Constitution of Ecuador makes it an item of its constitution, the legal personality of Pachamama, the legal personality of nature. You get to New Zealand, I don't know whether that is the Global South, certainly it is South to me. Again, you talk about the legal personhood of some natural items. You get to Bolivia. So, of course, there is a different notion of critique. And I find that it is much more to our time, the critique that comes from the Global South. There is, talking about time, there is also some other, issue that the Global South proposes to us, which is the way I see, because I'm from Europe, I'm Eurocentric, trust me, the way I see anachronism. What is anachronism? Anachronism is the way I see myself as cutting edge, and you all, even my friend from Yale, who's too new to me, as someone who's running after me. So that if, for instance, I create this concept, this notion of the rule of law, then of course you're going to get to where I was some decades, ago. Thank you.
Professor Peter Schuck, your last words from you. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay, apologies for that. Because we're mostly finished and have only a minute or two left, I do want to focus on a particular aspect of the questions that Yugank raised, which is the Global South. I think what we find is that there is, to some degree, and depending upon the openness of a legal system, it will affect how much of this is permitted or encouraged, a certain amount of competition between systems that you've characterized as the Global North and systems in what is characterized as the Global South. There are lots of exceptions. And that's desirable from this comparative point of view, because we are able to analyzed the performance across a variety of different indicia and standards, the performance of particular legal systems. So that's a very important feature of modernity and a very important dynamic that increasingly is possible for us. And I think both the global north and the global south have a great deal to learn from one another if those comparisons are accurate. If those comparisons are well-defined and the terminology is relatively precise, and the researcher goes into the comparison with no prior commitments, then I think we can end up with a lot of valuable information about how particular features of a legal system perform across a variety of different performance criteria. And so that's extremely important. And the global north has a great deal to learn from this. And in fact, the United States Supreme Court has been divided about, it's not so much the north and the south as it has been the east and the west, but the US Supreme Court is very much divided as to whether and to what extent the United States and American law more generally should take account of the different legal features of systems in the East and in the South. So this is a very, very good thing.
Thank you, Professor Peter Schuck, and thank you so much. It seems like I feel like as if we can go on for 2 more rounds, sure, but with the paucity of time, I really want to thank all our panelists for not just having a good discussion, but a discussion which is critical of each other, one another, so that we can think more.